One other change that we've made with respect to import configurations, we have a new type of import configuration that's for a specific scenario, but just to briefly point it out, there's now an import configuration that has this title right here that says Add Project IDs to Existing Activities. And this is a template, which basically means it's an import configuration that's been shared with everybody. And so it's built into the system and everyone has access to it. And just to very briefly show you what it looks like, it's quite simple. But it just has 4 columns. One is an activity ID. And then there's 3 more columns that are for a project ID. And this is a specialized import configuration designed specifically for a scenario where you've already imported and submitted your data to WQX, but you wish to do sort of a mass update of that data and add some additional project IDs to those activities for whatever reason. And so this allows you to not have to go and find all of your original data and add the project IDs to that original data and resubmit it. It still does, however, require that you are aware of the original activity IDs, but if you can load a file with an activity ID in it and 1 to 3 project IDs, this would then import that data and then update WQX by just adding those project ID references to your existing activities. It does work a little bit differently than the other imports. In that it's a feature that's not currently supported by WQX, and so when you go this route to update the projects on an activity, I'll just highlight a couple minor changes. So if I'm looking at some imports I've done with that process in mind, here's one that I've imported already. And the only sort of subtle change is that up here normally you have a button that says export and submit to CDX. And in this case, because it's going to update the WQX database directly, there's just an update WQX button. For the most part, it looks and behaves similar, except that once you click that, it'll basically begin updating the WQX database and it'll give you a progress bar on that. And when you're done, it will just tell you that it was successful or not. There won't be a processing report like you're used to seeing with submissions to CDX. To highlight a few other changes with our import configurations, let me pull up another example here. If there's someone on the line that doesn't have their phone muted, if you could mute your line, that would be appreciated. In this example, so previous versions of WQX Web, there was a column right here that was called default value. And this has been replaced with something a little different in this version of WQX Web. And that's partly because there were sort of nuances to the way default value behaved that sometimes was unclear to some users. For example, the behavior was a little different when you had a column that was mapped to one element versus a column that was mapped to multiple elements. And so, and likewise, there could be scenarios where you had a default value set here in the import configuration for a particular element, and then also a set of translations. And sometimes it could be unclear exactly how those two concepts worked and which one had precedence. And so we've made some changes, not just for those reasons, but for some other reasons, for some of these advanced features that I'll show. We've basically taken that concept of a default value and consolidated it within our translations page. And so there's no longer a default value per se, although we do still convey some of the same information that we used to have in our default values. There's no way to edit it here on this page. And I'll come back and give a brief explanation of what these columns are and how they're used. So let me click on an example of, so this column N here I have mapped to 5 different elements within WQX. So if I click on this edit link, I can take a look at the translations that have been set up. Now you'll certainly notice that the translation page does look fairly different. And so I'll explain a bit on how this new layout works. Basically, the page is divided into two sections. The top section is basically my list of translations. So in this case, I've got two separate translations. And as I click on a row, it basically updates this lower section, which is basically the details for a translation. And this is where all the editing is done, is down here in this details section. So you have a list and then details for editing one translation at a time. Translations include several new dimensions now that can make them feel a bit more complex to use. To help make them easier to understand, the translation details read like a sentence that describes how to find a match and what action to take when a match is found. So for example, if we just look a little bit at it sort of works both in the list and in the details. For example, if I'm looking at the details down here, it basically says when column n is not blank, which basically means when there's a value in column n, then use these element values. So this is basically a translation that is telling the system what to do when there's any value in that column, not necessarily a specific value. And then down here are basically the details that are spelled out about that translation. Maybe to show one that's a little more similar to our translations that we had previously, here's another example where it says when column n equals nd, then use these element values. And then we spell out what values we want to use in WQX when we have a value of nd in our import column. So this is something that existed before. It's just a little more sort of sentence structured, but also there's a number of new features that change the way and enhance the way translations can work. So for example, if I wanted to just create a new translation, I click the Add New button here, and it basically gives me a blank row up above, and then down here I can define my new translation. The first question is basically sort of a comparison type. And so if I open up the list, there's basically three choices. The equals is basically equivalent to our translations that we had in the previous version. So those are going to be the most common, where you're just saying, I want to make a translation. When the column equals some value, then I want to use some other value in WQX. So that one's pretty straightforward. But also there are two other choices. One is blank and is not blank. So for example, if I pick is blank, I'm basically saying that whenever I don't have a value for this column in my import file, then I tell it what I want it to do. So the most common option is basically just to spell out some values that I might want to use as a default. Now this tends to be most useful when I just have a single element that's mapped to that column. But in a few cases it may still be useful when you've mapped a column to multiple elements. But for example, if I wanted to say whenever my import column value is blank, then I want to use a specific detection condition. Now one thing you'll notice over here is that as I hover on these sort of element names that have been mapped to this column, there's a menu that pops up to give us a number of choices to help us set up this translation. So for example, I could pick a value from one of the lists. So in the case here, I could say pick a result detection condition. And this basically will open up the list of result detection conditions. I could pick one below reporting limit in this case, and it basically just fills this in for me. So this is saying whenever the column's blank, I want to just use below reporting limit. And if I wanted to leave the result value blank, I could leave it blank. I could pick a detection limit type by doing the same thing, picking from the pick list. Or I could also have this other choice that says use the value from the import file. So this can be useful in situations where, for example, I maybe pick this previous one that we began creating. So this is saying whenever I have ND in my file, I want to say not detected as my detection condition. I want to leave the result value blank. So this has just been left blank, and when I take my cursor off of it, it reminds me that the value is going to be blank when this translation is used. But I want to use a method detection level for my detection limit type. I want to use a value of 0.2 and units of milligrams per liter. And so this basically creates a translation that says anytime I've got an ND in my file, then just populate these detection conditions and limits, but leave the result value blank. And so this is an example of where you may set up some values and then leave the other blank because you actually want that type of conversion to occur. And so these, you know, more or less these two new values of is blank and is not blank are the replacements of the default values that used to exist. And so that's essentially what defaults were doing before, is they were allowing you to provide a value that you wanted to use when the value was blank, or when there was some value but you didn't care what that value was, you could use the defaults previously, but now they're incorporated into our translations. There's another option here after this sort of then word, is instead of giving it specific values that you want to use, let's jump back maybe to this is blank option. Let's say in this case I want to say, well, if my column n is blank, then I just want to discard the entire result. So this might be some sort of scenario where you've been getting error. It sounds like maybe someone hasn't muted the line. If you could mute your line, please. If you had a scenario where previously there were cases where you might have, say, a crosstab file or something, and there might be cases where there's just a blank value for a result, and the system would come up with errors. For example, it might say you've provided some result units but not a result value, and it'd give you an error. So in certain situations, it's convenient to be able to tell the system how to discard a value that's in your file that you don't really want to import. And so in this case, it's saying whenever the column is blank, I want to discard the result. But you could set up other scenarios as well. You might say, well, whenever the value equals, 99999, which, this is just a made-up scenario that I'm creating on the fly. But let's say for some reason my probe has some value that it puts in there whenever there's an error with the probe. I might say, well, whenever the value equals this, then discard the result. And so you can set up different scenarios and avoid some errors that were occurring in the past by just using some of these new translation features. One other thing to mention, if you are creating a translation and you want to provide a specific value for one of these elements, you are allowed to type directly into these boxes. But of course, keep in mind that if you do it directly, you're not making sure that that is a valid value. And so even though you're allowed to type in there, generally, unless you're completely confident that the value you're providing is a valid value within WQX, it's better to use these menus off the side to pick something from the list. And that way, you know that you're picking something legitimate rather than just typing it in the box. Another thing to highlight here with your translations is if you do set up many translations, there's essentially a priority column here to the left. And this is spelling out that there may be scenarios where more than one of these translations essentially is true for a particular row of your import file. And so the priority is to spell out sort of a precedent. So that priority order is used to determine that if there's a match, for example, on priority 1 translation, then it supersedes something that shows up as a 4, which is the lowest priority. And to maybe highlight a few more details about that, we'll show a new feature within the translations, which is this expert mode, which adds some additional features to translations that goes beyond kind of these enhancements I've shown up to this point. Before showing those, I guess I'll just sort of make the disclaimer that the expert mode for translations is, legitimately designed for users that are very comfortable with technical concepts like these. And so it's certainly not something that the typical WQX web user is going to use on a regular basis. But they are still very useful in a number of situations. And so it allows the store at help desk or consultants or contractors like myself to handle some scenarios that we couldn't handle in the past, and allows us to provide better services and support to users that are trying to get data loaded with some of these advanced features. So in showing this, recognize that some of this is somewhat complex, but it does highlight some of the power of some of these new features in WQX Web. I guess before we jump into that, one last thing to highlight here is I mentioned these 2 columns now that have replaced the default value in our previous version of WQX Web. Now instead we have 2 columns, and essentially, as I mentioned before, those choices of is not blank or is blank are basically the replacement for defaults. And so now the page is basically saying, if we're just kind of just read this right here, it's saying, well, whenever the result value type, or rather the value we import in column P, is blank, then just fill in actual as our result value type. So it's essentially like a default before, except it's a little more explicit in that there's 2 different types. One is for when it's blank, and one is for when it's not blank. And then once again, these can't be edited here. They're actually edited in your translation page, but it's useful in many cases just to see them here on this page as a reminder that you've set up these fairly generic blank or is not blank translations. And then in many cases, you will see some things that are spelled out directly, like this actual, but you'll also see some that are sort of in brackets. And these are meant to basically highlight something that's not something you literally typed in as your translation value, but is some sort of concept or behavior that's going to occur, and it's reminding you of it. So in this case, for example, with this column N up here, I can see that whenever I have a value in my column that's not blank, so it's going to leave the result detection condition blank, but it's going to take the value from my import file, and this says use value from import file. And so this is a reminder that whenever I have a value in my column that doesn't match any other translation, but it is a legitimate value, it's going to leave the detection condition and the limit type and value blank, but it's going to take the value from my import column and put it in the result value element in WQX. So it's kind of a complex concept, but it does allow you to do some interesting scenarios that are useful. And then in this case, this says for the result detection limit units, it says automatic, see options. And that's just a reminder that you are not literally providing the result detection limit unit. It's going to be automatically populated for you based on an option that you selected in your import configuration. So that's just a reminder that we've set up this option here that says populate the detection limit units for us. Okay, so the last